Thanks so much, Dave. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Silicon Valley is synonymous with innovation, and not just innovation, disruptive innovation, new growth for the economy, creating jobs, the cutting edge innovation that gets people excited, and the thought that Silicon Valley is this engine that does it again and again. But what if I told you that Silicon Valley really wasn't any of those things? That evergreen businesses, in fact, were far more poised to be the engines of disruptive innovation, first and foremost. Second, to be the places where market creating innovations occur that spur new job growth, not just for the businesses, but frankly, for our entire economy and the society. And third, that evergreen businesses were poised to be able to do that innovation again and again and again. In other words, they're no one-hit wonder, whereas Silicon Valley businesses just might be. Let me tell you more about why I think this is the case. So first, I want to dive into what is disruptive innovation. When my mentor, Clay Christensen, coined this phrase, he meant something very specific by disruptive innovation. But the theory has come to take on so many different meanings. It's one of the most misunderstood concepts in business today. I'd argue that venture capital firms and startups in Silicon Valley, they basically use the phrase disruption or disruptive innovation to justify anything that they want to do, basically. But it means something specific, and it's really just a theory of competition. It's like game theory. Disruption basically says if we take these steps, the large incumbents who one day will be our competitors, they're likely to take these other steps, and that will cede more ground for us so that we can grow and become a big company in the long run and transform an industry. And this is how it works. It doesn't start with these high-flying, breakthrough, cutting-edge innovations. Instead, disruptive innovation really brings to the market simple innovations, often primitive by traditional standards. And they start with people who can't consume the existing products or services. They start small there and they bring forth a product or service that's far more affordable, convenient, accessible, and simple. And then they get better over time such that they transform the market. Now, how does that work? What I've done here is plot a series of concentric circles. And what I want you to imagine is that that innermost circle represents those people with the most expertise or wealth in a given market. And then as we go out successive circles, it represents people who have less expertise or less wealth. Now, what we see in every single market is that the innovations, they tend to start in that center circle with people who have lots of expertise and lots of wealth. And then it's the process of disruptive innovation that effectively decentralizes the world. Let me just show you how it played itself out in the computers. So if you went back some 70 years ago or so, the computing industry was basically mainframe computers, these large $2 million machines that very few people knew or had the expertise to use, and very few people could afford to even own. And so these big machines were in the center of the market, and most of us existed in these outer circles as what we would call non-consumers. Literally, we did not have the expertise or wealth to be able to use a mainframe computer. Now, there was a disruptive innovation in the mini computers, which only cost $250,000, still pretty complicated to use, and most of us just didn't have access to computers when these got invented in the 60s and 70s and early 80s when they were in their heyday. And what was so interesting about the mini computers was there was this high-flying company called Digital Equipment Corporation, or DEC, as it was known, that was basically the company to emulate in the early 1980s. All the management articles talked about how you just wanted to be like DEC, basically. But a really interesting thing happened to DEC. While they were just high flying with their mini computer business, in the late 1980s, around 1989, their business just fell off a cliff. And the reason was they missed the big disruptive innovation that came along, which was the desktop or personal computer. Here's the interesting thing about the personal computers. Those machines, they were so simple and primitive, they could barely do any of the computations or calculations that DEC's demanding clients needed done. They were so simple and they were so affordable, they only cost a couple $1,000s, that when DEC looked at these products, they just weren't all that exciting, right? They wouldn't help them grow their business. They didn't promise these engines of growth, and they just couldn't figure out how to prioritize them. Incidentally, DEC actually built 4 versions of the personal computer, but they just couldn't prioritize them. And then they look out and they'd say, is there a market for these machines? And they couldn't find one because the early personal computers were basically just sold as toys for hobbyists. It looked like much ado about nothing in the 1970s. And so they couldn't quantify a market that would make sense. And so the decision, in essence, that they faced was, should we build worse products that our customers won't buy, where there's really no market, and so the profits from this would kill our business model? Or should we build better products, what we call sustaining innovations, invest in improving the mini computer for our best customers for profits that will delight Wall Street? And it's a true innovator's dilemma, because companies that have institutional investors, you literally cannot invest in these new markets where there's nothing today, where you can't size the market and you can't justify that investment. And so these areas of non-consumption, which is where real disruptive innovation always comes, you just cannot prioritize in your business. And so venture capital, try being a startup, going to a venture capital firm and saying, hey, we've got this great idea for a business. We can't tell you that there's a market right now, or it's just a small beachhead. Doesn't make much sense, but trust me, it'll work out somehow. There's no way any VC firm today will be interested and trust you that you can create a market where none exists. But that's how disruptive innovation works, in successive waves of the computing market for sure, but in lots of different industries. GM, disrupted by Toyota, didn't come in with the high-flying cars like the Lexus that they have today. They came in at the bottom with cars that basically were more affordable, so that people that couldn't afford the gas-guzzling large automobiles from Ford and GM could finally have an automobile. Who's been disrupting Toyota? It's a great question. It's not Tesla, despite what you might be reading. Tesla's raised roughly $20 billion of capital, and they've lost roughly $9 billion or so of capital. That's not where the disruption is coming from at the high end. It's coming from places like the Koreans, Kia, Hyundai, right? And they've come up market. And then the Chinese underneath them. Places that they say, yeah, there's not a market today, but we're going to build one. It's not Silicon Valley. Here's a simple set of tests for you to think about, is something disruptive or not? Just boiled it down to 6 different questions to help people think about, is this really in fact a disruptive innovation? The first thing to remember is that disruption is always relative. You don't just magically be disruptive. You have to be relative to other competitors in the market, because this is a theory of competition. If we're Apple and we introduce the personal computer, DEC's not going to fight us because they don't see a market there. And so the first test is the innovation targeting people who are non-consumers or overserved by existing products? Second, the innovation has to be not as good as the existing products, as judged by the historical measures of performance. Third, it's got to be simpler, more convenient, or more affordable. And then there's got to be a technology enabler that allows it to get better over time. Fifth, it's got to be paired with a business model innovation that allows it to be sustainable over the long haul. And finally, and this is the really big one, the existing providers have to be motivated to ignore the new innovation because they're not threatened at the outset. In fact, ignoring it makes their business model feel better. It might even make them more profitable in the short run. And so here's the big takeaway, which is that evergreen businesses with patient capital, thinking in terms of building something for the long run, evergreen businesses can chase markets that don't yet exist. But VC-funded businesses, they're going to struggle too, because they're looking for markets right now, here and now. And it's just not going to make sense generally to invest where there's just not a market size that they can put a big price tag and venture capital firms can justify because they can see an exit that will make sense for their business model. Now, the second point I want to make is not only are evergreen businesses more likely to create disruption, they're also more likely to generate growth for their bottom lines, but also for the economy writ large. They're much more likely to be innovations of growth, if you will. And for this set of insights, this comes from a framework that Clay Christensen started to develop at the end of his life. And it's a bit confusing because he was so known for disruption, but this framework is different. Whereas disruption was focused on a theory of competition, this framework of innovation was really focused around, are we helping to create new growth for the economy, and to help explain why growth and jobs and things like that had just struggled so much. And basically what Clayton concluded was that there were three different kinds of innovations seen through this other lens. And these three different kinds of innovation, they were all important, but they were all different, and they produced different kinds of growth. The first kind he called market creating innovations. These were very similar to disruption. They were simple and affordable. They targeted new consumers or non-consumers. And the impact was that they created huge new markets, which created new jobs and enabled development. What was different from disruption was that there could be a technology enabler, and it might be a disruption, but there didn't have to be a technology enabler for it to create a new market. And all of these things, though, had huge impact on creating jobs and growth. The second kind of innovation, he unfortunately, I would argue, named a sustaining innovation, because it sounds like that same innovation from his framework on disruption. But a sustaining innovation in this context was basically for a mature business. It was those sorts of investments where they were improving their current products and services. So think of a microprocessor company making the microprocessors even faster, or a smartphone manufacturer adding a better camera on the phone. Improvements like that that largely are incremental or maybe breakthrough, but they're on top of the platform, and they're targeting existing customers. They're not creating new markets. And as a result of that, they're creating few jobs, if any at all. And they're not this huge explosion behind growth in the economy or for businesses over time. They're important, mind you, because you need to hang on to market share if you're a business, but they're not that engine of new growth. And then the third kind of innovation that he talked about was what he called an efficiency innovation. Efficiency innovations essentially do more with less. They strip cost out of something to save money and return capital into the economy. An incredibly important function, but it's targeting existing customers. It actually eliminates jobs, so it can be negative in terms of net growth for the economy itself. Now, here's the interesting thing about these three kinds of innovations: market creating, sustaining, and efficiency. Each requires different kinds of capital and has different payback periods, which means different kinds of businesses can or can't prioritize them. In the case of market creating innovations, they require capital, a lot of it often, and they have long payback periods. These sorts of innovations literally take 10 to 15 years to develop. And remember, the market doesn't exist at the outset. And so you need capital that can prioritize for the long term. And the reality is VC funded businesses, they're looking 3 to maybe 7 years out at best these days. If you're institutional money, say in the public markets or private equity firms, you're often looking quarter to quarter or maybe 3 years out, right? To be able to invest behind a market creating innovation where the market doesn't exist yet, and the time horizon to create it is 10 to 15 years, just doesn't make sense for businesses that take that sort of institutional capital. Whereas an evergreen business, you're thinking in terms of generations, right? Passing it along and so forth. And so the time horizon, 10 to 15 years, fits in quite well into the structure of an evergreen business. For sustaining innovations, this requires less capital to do, certainly some injection. It's a medium payback period, and the market exists. So institutional capital can certainly prioritize it. And then efficiency innovations require much less capital, and frankly, it's returning capital, and it's an incredibly short payback period because the returns are seen pretty quickly. And here, businesses with institutional capital and evergreen businesses can both prioritize getting behind efficiency gains, and it's important to do. So here's the second takeaway, though, which is that public or VC-funded companies, they're going to struggle to focus on the long term. Evergreen businesses, however, are perfect for the long term, and that's perfect for creating new markets. Here's the third takeaway of how evergreen businesses are far more poised to be the engines of this sort of innovation over and over again. And this insight follows out of these first two ones, which is basically that the observation that incumbents, existing organizations, they really struggle when disruption is afoot in their market. For the reason that we saw with Digital Equipment Corporation, it's really hard for them to prioritize disruptive growth. And as we've studied this, what we've concluded is that there is actually a way for those organizations to survive disruption and actually pioneer market-creating innovations or disruptive innovations over and over and over again, and actually become the repeaters of this sort of innovation. It's not easy, but the playbook exists, and it's literally the only way we've reliably found for businesses to disrupt themselves. And the key is to first frame the disruption or this new market as a threat. This could kill our business. This could cannibalize our sales. It's important to frame it as a threat so you get the attention of the folks in the company. And so everyone prioritizes that and agrees that this is something important we need to pay attention to. But you can't leave it as a threat. Because if you leave it as a threat, something sets in, which is called threat rigidity complex. Basically paralysis. It's like an animal that sees prey coming after it, and you hunch your back and you sort of, the hairs stand up, and then everyone just freezes. And they stare at this innovation and they say, oh my goodness, this could kill us. What should we do? And don't act. And the key is for leaders to be able to reframe it as an opportunity for us to grow the business because, hey, the cannibalization is going to happen. It might as well be us with our values and our opportunity to go chase this. And this is where a framework called dual transformation comes in. It basically says that all businesses, they have a business model made up of a value proposition, resources, processes, and a profit formula. And these elements of a business model, as they work together, become very interdependently locked. And the insight is that any idea that fits these four components of a business model will get readily funded and will get readily invested in and prioritized. But if a disruptive innovation comes along, something that doesn't fit these four boxes, if you will, then the business model, it has a natural instinct. One is to either ignore, deprioritize the new innovation and basically reject it. That's what essentially happened with Digital Equipment Corporation and those personal computers. Or what might happen is it might say, no, this innovation is interesting, but we're going to twist and turn it and morph it to make it fit our needs, the needs of the business, as opposed to the market and the consumers for whom it was designed originally. And so out of this insight, what we've concluded is that business units are incapable of evolving, but corporations that are able to set up lots of different business units, lots of different business models, are able to evolve over time. And they do it by having, in essence, in investing in our core business today, what we call business A, strengthening today. That's where we do our sustaining innovations. That's where we do our efficiency innovations to make ourselves better prepared for today's market. And at the same time, we launch these B businesses where we're creating tomorrow, these fledgling business units that might be this engine of disruption or market creation over time. And it's key to invest in these things and prioritize them and keep them separate, wholly separate from the business model of A, of the traditional business. And so in between A and B sits what we call C, the capabilities link. And this is really where leadership sits. And your job as leadership is to protect B from A. But there's another cool thing that incumbent organizations can do, which is whereas startups are constantly groveling for cash and making all sorts of compromises to be able to grow quickly, established businesses that do this right can basically say, we already have a lot of resources from our core business today, business A, if you will. And we can use that to invest in B. And in fact, if business B wants to borrow any resources or processes from the mothership, so to speak, we will allow it to have whatever it demands. But we will not allow A to impose anything on business B that would co-opt its business model in effect. And so this is this capabilities exchange or capabilities link is really critical to being able to manage these businesses. But here's the interesting thing about that, which is that evergreen businesses are able easily to set up these alternative business units, these new fledgling business units, because as an evergreen business, you're able to make these trade-offs. Whereas if you're a publicly traded company, good luck making these trade-offs, because unless investors see immediate growth opportunities, they're just prioritizing growth, growth, growth. That's what drives stock price. Unless they see immediate growth prospects, they're just going to ignore this opportunity and tell you to shut down these businesses. But if as an evergreen business, you can create these fledgling businesses and be patient for growth. Remember, you've got those 10 to 15-year time horizons. Be patient for growth, but impatient for profit. You can create businesses that are durable. So even when there's a downturn in the economy or step back in the core business and cash gets tight, if you have these profitable small business units that are starting to create the wave of new market creating innovations, new disruptive innovations, then they will survive that instinct of to try to quash these new businesses. And that's where evergreen businesses have such an advantage over public and VC funded companies, because they struggle to prioritize profit over growth. It's why Silicon Valley is awash right now in mania of just growth, growth, growth. And then they say, well, we'll figure out profitability once you go public. Good luck with that once you have a big business where multiple business units are competing for scarce resources. But if you can be patient for growth and impatient for profits over the long haul, that leads not just to explosive growth, but sustainable growth that is built to last. And that's why evergreen businesses have a huge structural advantage over VC and public funded businesses, both in pioneering disruptive innovations, creating new markets, and then doing it again and again and again to be these engines of innovation that produce growth, not just for them, but for our economy and society writ large. It's a huge opportunity to keep being these innovators. And thank you so much for the time today to talk to you about the important role that you're playing in our society.